Education Programs Manager, and we want to thank you for coming out today for our Juneteenth celebration. We hope that you've been having a wonderful time today, checking out our exhibits, our programs. Maybe you took some time to create a time capsule. But this afternoon, we have a panel discussion that is dealing with 19th century Afrofuturists. We're doing this program in connection with our programming Black Futures, Black Imaginings, and we have several illustrious scholars here that will be talking about how did 19th century Black freedom fighters reimagine a free Black society. I'm just going to introduce their names and our moderator, and I'm going to then give it to our moderator to move forward with this program. So today we have Dr. Daniel J. Broyld of University of Massachusetts-Lowell. We have Professor Angela Tate of National Museum of African American History and Culture. And lastly, we have Professor Nicole Ivy of George Washington University. This conversation is being moderated by Dr. Izetta Mobley. She's our Director of Interpretations, Collections, and Education. And at this time, I'm going to give it to her hands. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. Hello. Oh, one more time. Hello, everyone. Hello. Thank you. Thank you. We need all your energy as we begin to talk about very heavy things like 19th century Afrofuturists. We are so delighted to have you here, to have our scholars here for this conversation. Again, my name is Izetta Mobley. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm thrilled to have you here on Juneteenth, a commemoration and a celebration. We are on Piscataway and Nacogdoches land that was made possible through the labor of enslaved people of African descent. In fact, one of the largest auctions of people of color, particularly enslaved Africans, was held just steps from here. So as we think about the context in which we go to enter into this conversation, I want to call in those ancestors, indigenous, enslaved, and free Black people as well. And so we're delighted to have everyone here. Thank you. I'm going to start off with the bios of each of our wonderful panelists. We're so thrilled to have them and to have this conversation about 19th century Afrofuturists. I didn't mean to be a 19th century historian. It just like kept on me by accident. But you very rarely get to speak with 19th century historians and cultural thinkers who are also putting those thinkers into the context of the 21st century, right? And sort of these deeper lessons. I'm particularly excited that we have such a range of diversity of scholars, and that we have folks who are also going to be able to talk about everything from disability to music to comics, and all of the different ways that Afrofuturism and Afrofuturistic thinking and Black futures and Black imaginings showed up. So I'll begin. Dan J. Broyld is an associate professor of African American history at UMass-Lowell. He earned his PhD in 19th century United States and African Diaspora history at Howard University.
Hate you.
Look, I waited, I fought, I understood the situation. His work focuses on the American-Canadian borderlands and issues of Black identity, migration, and transnational relations. Broyld was a 2017-18 Fulbright Canada Scholar at Brock University, and in his book, Borderland Blacks, Two Cities in the Niagara region during the final decades of slavery, which I just ordered, is published with the Louisiana State University Press. Angela Tate is a PhD candidate specializing in African American and African diaspora and cultural studies. Her dissertation looks at the Cold War era radio programs hosted by Etta Moulton Barnett and provides a significant intervention in the role Black women played in broadcasting civil rights and Pan-African news. Her work has been published in Resonance, the Journal of Sound and Culture, and other including publications. She currently serves as the first women's history curator at the National Museum of African American History and Culture through the Smithsonian American Women's History Initiative. In her spare time, she writes historical fiction and has taken up learning to DJ. Here's Angela. We have a soundboard and Afrofuturism, so you can hop right on. Professor Nicole Ivy writes and thinks about racial formations, memory, and the labor of representation. Her teaching, scholarship, and public engagement work highlight how knowledge about difference, both embodied and enacted, is produced and maintained over time. She received her joint PhD in African American Studies and American Studies from Yale University. She has held appointments as an Andrew W. Mellon Foundation and American Council of Learned Societies Public Fellow. And an also postdoctoral fellow at the Center for Research on Race and Ethnicity and Society at Indiana University, Bloomington, and an Institute of Museum and Library Services fellow at the African American Museum in Philadelphia. Her research has also been supported by the Ford Foundation, the McNeil Center for Early American Studies at the University of Pennsylvania and the University of Notre Dame. In addition to these appointments, she also served as the inaugural Director of Inclusion for the American Alliance of Museums and publishes widely on the role of museums and art organizations in promoting equitable futures. And I should say in particular that Dr. Ivy has been mentor, friend, colleague, when you're trying to lift your little bodies over that PhD finish line. So it really is a delight to have all of these scholars on board, and I can't wait to, as they say, get into it. I'm mainly a historian because I like receipts about the tea, so this is my favorite part. So Dan, I'm gonna hand it over to you to go ahead and make the presentation.
Hi, cheers. How's everyone doing? Good. Wow, that's good. Happy Juneteenth. So I am happy to be here speaking at the Lewis Museum for Juneteenth. I'm here to give a concise talk which highlights a portion of my work on Afrofuturism and also Black freedom celebrations. I entitled the talk, the brief talk, 19th Century Black Freedom Fighters Reimagined. And so the talk will briefly explore the lens of Afrofuturism to address the new dynamics of the Underground Railroad, detailing what imagination, tact, and technology it took for fugitive Blacks to flee to what I call the outer spaces of slavery. The talk also highlights the intersections of race, technology, and liberation by retroactively applying the modern day concept of Afrofuturism to 19th century Black moments. And it also includes comments on Juneteenth. So this presentation really kind of involves three works that I've done, kind of an amalgamation of these three works. The first being my book, Borderland Blacks, but the last two are the most important. It's an article I wrote called The Underground Railroad as Afrofuturism, Enslaved Blacks Who Imagine Freedom, Future, and Space. And so you will hear a bit of each of these works in this brief talk. And so the article, The Underground Railroad as Afrofuturism, I really tried to kind of reconceive 19th century Blacks, and I asked the questions of, were enslaved Blacks Afrofuturists? How can Afrofuturism be used to grasp the tangible Underground Railroad network and its attached American mythology? And how does the Underground Railroad comprehensively mix modernity, fairy tale, and actual movement of Black fugitives? For me, thinking about Black people that are running away from the American South and thinking about them using the most modern technologies like a steamship or a train. I'm saying, and using the North Star, I'm saying this is kind of futuristic, right? I mean, and they're using the most modern technology. And what if you were enslaved in the American South? Wouldn't you take anything out of enslavement, especially something that can get you there faster, right? And so instead of using the kind of, the horse of, blood and muscle, right? Why won't you get on the iron horse, right? The train that can get you to freedom faster, right? So I'm kind of looking at these things when I'm looking at, 19th century Black people. So, with the manifesto exhibit, I don't have to kind of explain what Afrofuturism is, but, Mark Derry, an individual that, interviewing other scholars such as Greg Tate, Samuel Delaney, and Trissa Rose, is coming up with this ideal of Afrofuturism, but really Mark Derry, is trying to kind of introduce Black people to the future. Because if you were read sci-fi before Afrofuturism, it was as if Black people weren't going to show up in the future. The future was all Black, right? And so what Afrofuturism does is it intervenes and says, no, we're going to be there, right? We've made it this far, we're going to be in the future, right? But if you look at sci-fi before, it was like, we didn't show up, or we were in the background, or doing these kind of subservient, things. And so what Afrofuturism really does is just say that, Black people are going to be there. And it also tries to, kind of reinterpretate our freedom and our liberation and what it looks like. And so though the concept of Afrofuturism was invented in 1993, you have to understand that it predates the invention of the actual name. For example, there was gravity before John Newton said that there was gravity, right? And before Karl Marx, came up with Marxism, there was economic determinism, right? And so the thing is, before the actual name, the actual thing was already being manifested, right? So Afrofuturism was happening in the 19th century, and it's happening in the 21st century as well. How most of us know Afrofuturism and got introduced to the concept was really through the movie Black Panther, right? Even I started there, right? After the movie, I went home. I was living in Canada at the time, and I began to write the piece, The Underground Railroad, as Afrofuturism, basically retroactively applying Afrofuturism to the Underground Railroad, right? I'm like, wait, this is futuristic, right? Harriet Tubman, you gotta know some things, right? To be able to do this, right? And so that's what I began to do with that. The other thing that I really like about Afrofuturism is Afrofuturism really, again, introduces those kind of cultural elements to futurism. Futurism was always a thing, but Afrofuturism adds the cultural element to this. And you see this with pessimism, you see this with minimalism, where now, Black people and Black scholars are starting to say, let's add the Afro to it because it adds the cultural heritage to the actual existence of the thing, right? That is already in existence, which is very important. The other thing that I like about Afrofuturism is that, Afrofuturists, they say things like, thinking of Beth Coleman, she's talking about, race as technology. So she's saying that race is not only a kind of cultural construct, but it's also manifesting as a technology where it determines where people live, what type of healthcare you receive and things of that nature. So Afrofuturists, see race as a technology. And also, Afrofuturism is constantly upgrading like technology, which I love. The other thing that Afrofuturism does is really challenge isms. And I love Afropunk, this concert that, that I usually go to in Brooklyn, but it's, they have concerts in London, things of that nature, Paris. But upon entering the Afropunk concert, they ask you to, not be any of these things, right? So no sexism, no racism, no ableism, no ageism. And they're saying that this is how the future should manifest, right? Where these things don't even exist. And I'm like, I love going to this concert because I'm like, yes, you have to agree to these things before you kind of enter it. You're not going to do these things. And hopefully the future looks like this, right? Where there's none of these things. We don't have to worry about these things and everybody can just exist, right? So I love how Afropunk kind of manifests where they're saying that these things, you know, we're going to try to act in a futuristic manner by not having these things and bringing these things in. But you also see that Afrofuturists are talking about Black History Month and calling it Black Futures Month. And they're talking about, you know, how long until, you know, Black Future Month, right? And so not just talking about history, but talking about where Black people are going. And I really like this because it basically kind of says that if we can create a vision of the future, can we also create a new vision of the past, right? And this really transforms history from being merely events that occurred in the past, but a record that really guides the future. So getting into my ideal of the Underground Railroad as Afrofuturism, there's two concepts that I think is important that I deal with in this article. One is the Black inner geek, and also the outer spaces of slavery. And I'll explain those first, beginning with the Underground Railroad. I mean, you have to understand that the Underground Railroad, they're using modern, you know, technical terms, really techie terms to kind of say how the railroad is running, using track stations, diops, conductors, agents. These are really techie terms that Black people are using, right? And when we think of enslaved people, we often think of them as being low tech. But I'm saying that they're high tech, particularly the ones that are using the Underground Railroad, right? So, you know, we look at them as these kind of backward people that are, you know, just, you know, doing things in fields. But what I'm saying is that, you know, through Afrofuturism and looking at the Underground Railroad as Afrofuturism, we can see that these people were very invested in future freedom and things of that nature. We can see this with all of the kind of maps of the Underground Railroad. Now, to get to this concept of the Black inner geek, you have to understand that in enslavement, you couldn't show how smart you were, right? And so you could be, you know, beaten for displaying that you could read and write and things of that nature. And so what I'm saying is that the Underground Railroad really is manifesting in a way to show how intelligent these Black people are, because they can't show how intelligent they are in slavery, right? But when they get away, it's basically saying that, you know, they were hiding that Black inner geek, right? It kind of reminds me of when I was in high school, when I had to hide how smart I was, because I went to a bad New York, you know, high school, right? And so they, you know, but now today, my nieces and nephews are coding and, you know, developing websites and stuff like that, and it's cool, right, to be kind of a geek, right? Well, you have to understand, for enslaved people, they couldn't show how smart they were, and so they had to hide this Black inner geek. But really, the Black inner geek rescues enslaved people from the stereotypes of being technophobes and asserts that they could keep pace with the techno culture if they were not high tech, if you will, hijacked, right? And two, you know, sometimes, you know, these people were looked at as being low tech, but when they couldn't find them, they understand that they've gotten away, probably using some of that modern technology. One individual that I'll point out is Henry Box Brown. This guy, the Express Mail had just came out, and he literally mailed himself to freedom. From Richmond, Virginia to Philadelphia. Express Mail had just came. So basically, he Amazon primed himself to freedom. And Frederick Douglass was mad at him because he was like, he published his narrative, and Frederick Douglass was like, do you know how many other people could have mailed themselves to freedom and you didn't tell that you mail yourself to freedom? So I mean, literally, this is Afrofuture. How do you harness the modern technology to get free? I mean, this is what young people are doing with social media, right? They're using social media to organize, if you will, the gathering, right? I mean, this is Afrofuturist, right? And so I really like Henry Box Brown. I mean, this guy's an Afrofuturist. This is literally thinking out of the box. I mean, this guy, I'm gonna mail myself. Like, watch this. And so this other thing that I come up with in this article is the outer spaces of slavery. And basically, this is any space that does not have slavery, like the American North, Canada, Africa, Europe, or anywhere else, right? Also, sometimes, too, you can't undermine the American South, because, like, you know, Black people hidden in the Florida Everglades, sometimes in the Dismal Swamp between the Carolinas and Virginia, right? And then sometimes just in towns like New Orleans and Charleston, right? But basically, the outer spaces of slavery are places without slavery, and these were like the cosmos. And fugitives had, to some degree, time travel when they entered these spaces. Can you imagine you're enslaved in the Carolinas and they tell you that there's free Black people in Boston or in Canada, and then you reach there? I mean, you just like time travel. You're like, what in the world? These black people are free, right? In their own homes and things of that. I mean, that's like unbelievable, right? I mean, like, what did we just do, right? And so the outer spaces of slavery is this concept I use to really kind of show, what's kind of going on here. And so basically, still when you reach the outer spaces of slavery, there's black holes and stars. Just because you reach the outer spaces of slavery doesn't mean that there's not coarse racial issues or segregation or alienation. So still, when you reach the outer spaces of slavery, you have to avoid the black holes, right? And you have to find the stars, right? And so it's not just, I reached the north, I reached Europe, there's no slavery here, it's great. And I really like what Sun Ra says. He says that space is not only high, it's low, it's the bottomless, it's endless. And so racism is endless. Even though you've reached the outer spaces of slavery, you still have to deal with racism, right? And so that's the bottomless that he's talking about. And so, a lot of people will look at what I'm saying now as kind of magical realism. But what I do in my book is I show that these things are real. That black people are using technology as far as the railroads, suspension bridges, steamships, major cities. And two, when they arrive in these major cities, can you imagine arriving in New York from Georgia? Like New York City today, people are looking around, like, I'm from New York, and so people are looking around like, oh my God, this is like the future, right? Can you imagine arriving as an enslaved person to one of these major metropoles? And then like the North Star, learning how to use the North Star. Rubbing spruce pine on your feet to get free, right? To throw off the smell of the dogs. This is fugitive technology. I'm a city slicker. I don't know anything about the woods. You put me in the woods, I have no idea. Good luck. I have no clue, right? And so I can barely find the North Star. I can find it, right? The city lights, but it's difficult. And so I look at all these things like the suspension bridges that are carrying people over Niagara Falls. You can see at the top of the suspension bridge over Niagara Falls, there is a train that goes over the top and people walk below. So black people are riding trains to freedom in the 19th century, right? And so this also kind of brings me to Juneteenth and freedom celebrations. There's several freedom celebrations that predate Juneteenth. I'm thinking of, July 5th. Black people didn't celebrate July 4th. A lot of times because they were working on the 4th, and then while everybody was inebriated, they got to do something on the 5th. And so also, too, you have the August 1st celebration, 1834, which is now Caravana, which is the British freedom celebration. But basically, when I'm thinking about these freedom celebrations, which Juneteenth is a part of, I wonder, why sometimes, black people have never heard or never attended the Juneteenth celebration, or why black people prior to 2021, I'm very interested in, which black communities celebrated Juneteenth. And this really has to do with kind of location, and the Texas Diaspora, also to the Poor People's Campaign in 1968. And so I'm also wondering where Juneteenth celebrations will go now that it's a national commemoration. But if you just look at the the Texas Diaspora, these are the places that really had large Juneteenth celebrations. I'm thinking about even George Floyd, who was from Texas originally. He made it to Minnesota, where he was killed, right? He's a part of that Texas diaspora that would know about Juneteenth, right? And so really, a lot of the celebrations, if you will, have to do with, people from Texas kind of, being dispersed, if you will, outside of Texas. And even the flag, the Juneteenth flag, the North Star, the Lone Star State is represented with the star, and then the burst, kind of symbolizing the diaspora, is there, and then also the horizon that is in the flag as well. So again, this is going back to Texas and that Texas diaspora. Also, too, for Texas, people from Texas, it's like a homecoming, right? It's kind of like, going to Howard and coming back for a homecoming. That's what people from Texas do. Or if they couldn't get back to Texas, they would start celebrations where they were, right? And so it has to do with this diaspora. You can see that the flag, if you will, the Juneteenth flag, was started in 1997. Before then, people just used the RBG flagged to kind of represent as well, but also to the Poor People's Campaign in 1968 after the assassination of Dr. King. People attended their first Juneteenth celebration at the Resurrection City, if you will, which was a tent city in Washington, D.C. that existed for 6 weeks. And so a lot of people from there would experience their first Juneteenth celebration, and they would take it home with them. And so to conclude, on the 19th century, Black techno thrillers solved the ultimate algorithm. Slavery, calculated subtraction that did not figure them into the equation. You have to understand, by solving slavery and getting out of slavery, you literally just solved an algorithm. That's a really tough algorithm to solve. And so enslaved people were not void of technology or simply primitive, unskilled laborers. They were driven by the Chronicles of Progress. Anything that's going to help your life, people are generally interested in. I keep talking to my wife about a Roomba because I don't want to vacuum anymore. Like, why vacuum if we can get something that rolls around? Like, it's going to make our lives easier, right? I'm remembering my dad telling me that we were the dishwashers, and then we got the dishwasher. Thank God. Like, anything that helps you, you're going to try to. So Black people identify technology will help us get to freedom faster with the train or the steamship or any of these kind of fugitive technology. Using them, they're trying to use them. I mean, that's what people do, right? They use technology to help them. And so by wearing these kind of low-tech masks, they were able to discreetly decipher the complex codes and usher themselves to the outer spaces of slavery with technology and gadgetry. Black fugitives recognized that a free future was possible if they could be teleported through modern technology. This makes them some of the most innovative, astute, cutting-edge modernists of their time. Blacks had the least resources, but were the most resourceful with the little information they could clandestinely mustered up by maximizing steam and other man-made machinery that carried themselves away from the clutches of bondage. Black runaways considered uneducated, unskilled, backwards, shiftless, amongst other things, outmaneuvered, managed to ride the most modern technologies to transform and invent a future away from their slaveholders that wanted to kind of power down these things. However, Blacks were state-of-the-art, light years ahead of what was expected, and basically operating on a covert frequency not to alarm of their exodus. These fugitives knew that the point of slavery was to technologically unplug and to power down their ability to use technology. Just as today, with the digital divide of today, people understand that, Blacks who are uninformed and don't have access to technology or are a technological underclass, it reduces their autonomy, right? And we know that today, if you don't have access to technology, it reduces your freedom. And Black people recognize this even in enslavement, that they had to get access to technology to enhance their freedom and their future. Thank you.
There's a lot of synergy between our presentations, and it's going to create a conversation. So I am the Women's History Curator at the National Museum of African American History and Culture. I'm a public historian by trade, and that means I am thinking about how history is interpreted by the public, how we remember history, how we think about historical celebrations. And so when I think about Juneteenth and Afrofuturism, I'm thinking in two parts. One, how Juneteenth is a continuum of celebrations of Black freedom and how freedom is celebrated through Juneteenth in a way that continuously harkens back to history. And that history resides within Black people because they are always walking in the past as well as in the present and in the future. And when you think about Afrofuturism, It's not just thinking about Black people in the future, it's Black people thinking about themselves now and where they were in the past. And if you haven't been to my museum, there's also an Afrofuturist exhibition up, so it's great that you all have an Afrofuturism exhibition as well, and amazing art from high school students, and I was very impressed. And so this is a picture I took, was in the exhibition, took some pictures for you all, just in case you don't get a chance to get down there, but it does close next March, so you have a couple of months. So Greg Tate, no relation, surprisingly, the late cultural critic who says, being Black in America is a science fiction experience. And as Dan explained through his amazing presentation, shares why. And so when I think about why Juneteenth is celebrated now as a national holiday, which some people are concerned about, because when you make something a national holiday, you are cementing it in its place. You are not thinking about how it has been used across time before it became institutionalized. And so when you think about the change of the COVID-19 pandemic combined with the George Floyd uprisings in summer 2020, and how everyone thought we should celebrate Juneteenth. And I'm sure that most people think, oh, it's a consolation prize. It just came out of nowhere. But I always think about how I celebrated Juneteenth growing up, because I'm from California, and I thought it was just the holiday that everyone celebrated. But as Dan pointed out, as I point out later on when thinking about mapping the Texas Diaspora, a lot of Texans moved to California in the 20th century, and I am kind of like a third generation Californian because my family moved to the state in the 30s. And so even though this Afrofuturism was 10 years, exhibition was 10 years in the making, it is part of this larger conversation that people have been having in the wake of 2020 of what is our place in this country? Has this nation lived up to its ideals? What are the symbols of these national ideas that say what it means to be an American, but also what it means to be African American? And so I also like to think about how watch night became a tradition in Black churches during Reconstruction. Watch night happened before what would become Juneteenth. And so this is a photo from our collection of a rendering of how African Americans might have celebrated watch night in the 19th century. As I always point out, I'm also a scholar of visual culture, and this was not created by a Black artist, so you just have to think about what were they doing by rendering this Black celebration around these Black people in this mainstream magazine and saying, well, this is what they did, this is how they celebrated these. You don't know, because Black history has always been something that has been under the surface, and Black people, including particularly Black women, have, as Darlene Clark Hines, the dissemblance, hiding what you're really experiencing, hiding what you really think in order to conceal things from those who would harm you. And so again, what is Juneteenth? And this is why I say it's important to think of it not as a fixed holiday or an alternative Independence Day. It's a way that African Americans have continuously thought about themselves in the United States as well as the world, particularly in moments of racial oppression and crisis. And so this is another photo from our collection about showing Texans celebrating music, performance, which is also a vital part of Black performance and Black identity. And this is the booklet. So again, I like pulling material culture from our collection because it makes things a little bit more real, and you also show how do we know what we know, because we have these objects in our collection, and that is how we interpret history. And this is the Emancipation Proclamation booklet that Union soldiers carried with them to tell everyone in slave states as they encroached upon the Confederate territory and conquered the Confederate Army, to tell the enslaved people, you are now free. Abraham Lincoln has declared everyone that is in the slave state to be no longer enslaved. And that ties into why Juneteenth exists. So many scholars today say Juneteenth is not about freedom, Juneteenth is about power. Because the reason why those in Texas were the last to hear about the Emancipation Proclamation is because slave owners take their enslaved people and continuously move west. that they could avoid the Union Army and telling their enslaved people that they were free. And so in Galveston, Texas, this is the General Order number 3 that was read by Major General Broyld, who was given the command of the District of Texas during Reconstruction. And so 1865, you think, oh, well, you know, the Civil War ended, Reconstruction began, but what was Reconstruction? Reconstruction was this moment in U.S. history where there was an attempt to live up to our ideals, to fully integrate African Americans into United States society. And of course, it failed for a variety of reasons, but this was this moment where African Americans increasingly moved into public office, moved into public spaces that they were previously barred from. And Juneteenth was not so much a moment of saying, oh, now we're free. This is saying we have already been free. We have seized our freedom. And this is just confirmation that we already knew we were. And so I also like to think about other emancipation days in the United States, because I think it's very important to think about the different contexts of slavery and freedom in the different states. So, you know, Virginia and Washington, D.C. in April, Mississippi, Florida, Georgia in May, and then Maryland in November. And I like to reiterate, what is Juneteenth? It thinks about the paradox of freedom and liberty in the United States. It's not an alternative Independence Day. It's a day to commemorate as opposed to celebrate, in my opinion. And going back to my interest and background in public history and thinking about how we know, how do we create public memory? How do we commemorate history, particularly in museum spaces, because museums are not neutral. And as I'm sure you will know, the African American Museum was 100 years in the making because of how museums and archives and galleries have historically neglected Black narratives, historically neglected Black collecting, which is why when that museum opened, and as well as when other Black history museums across the nation are open, people think you don't have anything. That doesn't exist. There's no proof. But it does exist because people held on to things. And despite being displaced, despite being burned out of their homes, everyone held on to their artifacts and was able to donate to the National Museum of African American History and Culture. And so when Juneteenth reemerged in the 20th century was when Texas decided to celebrate its 100th anniversary in 1936. At the time, African American Texans had to campaign to actually have their own food. The custom for a lot of World's fairs, including across the world, was to neglect and marginalize the African American presence. And so a lot of them grudgingly gave space to African Americans. And they were also surprised whenever they could raise enough money to erect their own building. And so this was the Hall of Negro Life at the Texas State Fair. And not only was it filled with art by African Americans, historical artifacts, but it was also a site of the Juneteenth celebration. And again, this is a map of both waves of the Great Migration, and you see Texas and Louisiana, like I said, going to California, or going up north. The first Great Migration wave was in response to lynching and extrajudicial violence. The second Great Migration was mostly in search of the Second World War. And this is a photo of the Poor People's Campaign that's in our collection. There's a wide range of photographs from this particular moment. And there's also, we also have in our exhibition on the third floor of the History Galleries, the actual graffiti wall that everyone had scribbled their own messages on to commemorate that this was a multiracial, multicultural, anti-capitalist gathering on the mall. And this is also, again, where Juneteenth reemerged when African Americans said, we're not living, the United States is not living up to its ideals, and we are going to bring this holiday to the people to show this is a holiday about equality, it's about anti-capitalism, it's about community. And a couple photos from the exhibition that I really like. So this is from the beginning, and these are the renderings from W.E.B. Du Bois's psychological or sociological and statistical renderings of African American life in 1900s that he brought to the Paris World Fair when the United States, again, like I said, World Fair, they said no African American presence representing the United States, and so W.E.B. Du Bois gathered photographs of Black Georgians and statistical renderings and took them to Paris himself, and he represented the buildings despite the United States saying they are not a part of us. And then one of the other sections that I really like, which focuses on Black women as the Women's History Curator, that's my specialty, and thinking about Henrietta Lacks and how her cells have become the basis of so many things that have helped people medically wise. And yet her family was not aware of how valuable these cells were. And like I said, Black people, particularly Black women, carrying history in their bodies, carrying freedom in their bodies. And then focusing on another Black woman, Opal Lee, the Juneteenth activist, the grandmother of Juneteenth, which is one of the reasons why it is now a national holiday. It wasn't a consolation prize, as some people on Twitter like to claim. It was from continuous activism and campaigning for it. And I do like to think about Black women organizing and how Black women's clubs were significant for history and cultural memory. A lot of Black women's organizations still exist, Black sororities, and they have immense personal archives full of historical facts that people don't think about because they don't know that that is where the true history lies. And I also like to think, again, Black women as keepers of history. If you've ever been to Frederick Douglass's house in Washington, D.C., it only exists because of the preservation work of Black women. And so I like to close with another photograph from our Afrofuturism exhibition where Alicia B12 says, there are Black people in the future, and it projects it onto the side of the building. Let's stretch it out. We got one more. And I'll try to be pretty short. I think I'm better in conversation than I am in presentation. My name is Nicole Ivy. I am writing a history of the enslaved women who were part of the gynecological trials in Alabama. I found myself researching the 19th century because I'm interested in the past, and I love what my colleague Azetta has said about the past as having receipts. I also like being able to track some of the work of the past and the present, some of the same things that were happening in the 19th century about how do Black people imagine freedom, how do Black people imagine family and build community and find safety, right? Some of these same strategies are things that are part of our inheritance today. So I'm interested in how the past works on the present. And I always talk to my students about, we're talking about the 1800s, right? We're talking about early America, but we're also talking about strategies of freedom and technologies that shape how we live and move and have our being today. So thinking about this confrontation between the past and the present, I want to offer another kind of definition of Afrofuturism. I know we've got a lot of terms to consider. And so as I begin to talk about two texts, I'm going to be talking about Black literary futures, how Black writers born in the 19th century sought to create a future otherwise. So I'm going to be sharing a few key terms, and they are absolutely in line with what our other presenters have talked about. So first of all, I want to talk about how Afrofuturism is also an aesthetic project. Right? So part of what Afrofuturism is about visual culture. It's about music and cultural production. So this is why when we think about Afrofuturism, some things come to mind even before Black Panther, right? Some of us may have even seen the Mothership from P-Funk, right? Some of us, right, may have seen Sunrise Spaces the Place, right? And so Mark Derry, his vision of Afrofuturism is a little less aesthetic. I actually like Natasha Womack's definition. And she writes that Afrofuturism is a way of looking at the future and alternate realities through a Black cultural lens. And what she means by Black cultural lens, she says Black cultural lens means the people of the African continent, in addition to the diaspora, the Americas, Europe, etc. So because I'm from Jacksonville, Florida, I'm gonna say country things in a little bit of time I have before you. So let's put a pin in that, right? Let's put a pin in this idea about Afrofuturism absolutely involving the diaspora, the continent, the Americas, and also Europe. Womack says also that Afrofuturism, she says, it is an artistic aesthetic, but also a kind of method of self-liberation or self-healing. And you see that absolutely right in what my colleagues have already talked about, this method of self-liberation. As an artistic aesthetic, it bridges literature, music, visual arts, film, and dance. Right? So on the one hand, you have it as an aesthetic practice, as a way of seeing the world. And then she says, as a mode of self-healing and self-liberation, it's the use of imagination that is most significant because it helps people to transform their circumstances. Right? And I think part of what's so exciting and has been so exciting about Afrofuturism is this potential to transform your present circumstance. So when we think about literary Afrofuturism, often we're talking about this mashup between the past and the future that happens in the present on the page. So thinking about this mashup between the past and the future that happens in the present, I want to detail two very, very old texts. I want to give a bit of a plot synopsis. I'm going to talk about the authors. Then I'm going to outline some of the provocations, right? Some of the potential, some of the productive questions that these texts raise for me. And hopefully we can talk about some of these questions together. I understand that many of you probably have not read these two novels. They're definitely 19th century texts. But I want to encourage you to look into them after today. Many of them you can find free online. You can get that from me. Right? I believe in like liberation for real, so all kinds of liberation. Okay, so the first novel I want to talk about is a novel called Blake or the Huts of America. Right? Now this text was written by Martin Delaney. It gets published in 1859. Martin Delaney is an abolitionist. He was born in West Virginia in 1812. He published this text actually as a serial publication. I'm gonna say more about that in a few minutes. But just the title is so hilarious to me, right? We tend to think about huts not as America. So you know right off the bat from the title that something is happening, right? There's an accusation. There's a telling of history, a telling of kind of an anthropological or an ethnographic story where we're studying the culture of America. So this absolutely turns on its head the idea of like African huts. And this is happening in 1859. It gets published in a Black newspaper. It's called the Anglo-African Magazine. So here we've got Martin Delaney imagining Blackness in Europe. Anglo-African in this context doesn't mean sort of an aspiration toward European cultural mores or anything like that. but he's suggesting that we can locate a Black world in Europe in as much as we locate Black presence in the continent of Africa, in as much as we locate Black presences in South America and in Central America. So Delaney, again, was a famous abolitionist. He broke with William Lloyd Garrison and those folks because he was absolutely in favor of armed resistance, right? He's known, right, so think about this, right? This is 1859, he's writing this text. This is 9 years after the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850s passed, right? That makes it a crime for Black people to move around the country. Well, really what it does is it empowers white people to capture African Americans, whether they are free or not, right? It empowers them to transport people that they claim to be enslaved or claim to be property. You could just snatch people up, right? So this is a story that in many ways prioritizes Black international mobility in a national context of the restriction of Black people. So because Martin Delaney who Martin Delaney was, and because he had this real focus on armed resistance, part of the sort of climactic movement of this novel is a rebellion. I won't get into the full plot in the interest of time, but one of the things that happens is its main character, Henry Blake's love interest is sold away from slavery. Henry emancipates himself, he escapes in pursuit of his beloved. He goes sort of throughout the South, organizing. And in a way, right, you can see that Martin Delaney is absolutely in literary conversation with the kind of organizing that Nat Turner did, right? This idea of like going around, inspiring people, organizing people. The plot sort of moves across the southern United States. Delaney gets a crew of folks together, or not Delaney, I'm sorry, Henry Blake, the protagonist, gets a crew of folks together. They commandeer a slave ship. They decide to go across through a reverse middle passage, get people who are enslaved, and create rebellions there, right? So basically taking the fight to the enslavers on the shores of the African continent. By turns, this plot fails and they end up in Cuba, staging a rebellion there, right? And it's a pretty tragic story. The plot is pretty convoluted. It's an abolitionist story, though, at its heart. It's an abolitionist story driven by rebellion. Now, one thing I want to note about this abolitionist story, right, is who is reading it. So let's talk about, how do you all read things today? Are we readers in the room? Are we readers? Okay. My friend in the Tupac shirt, how do you read things? Unfortunately, you made eye contact. Like, do you have a reading group? How do you find new books to read? How do you find new stuff to read?
Honestly, like stuff like this, like being part of conversations and learning from
Okay, nice. He says you find stuff to read by kind of community events like this. Yep, sorry, you got a hand too? Did you have your hand up?
I thought.
Oh! Now you're outside. Oh, podcast, right. So other recommendations, you have the networks. Yes. How do you find what to read?
Since I was in high school, for anything, whatever the latest novel come out, Black literature, it was in theme that you had read that. And then I have, even today, my friend, whatever the latest thing came out, the 1690 project or whatever, it's like, did you buy this for me? Because I've already bought it for you for your birthday or Christmas or something like that. So it was just like, it was like an in thing. And you would find out like in like magazines like Essence Magazine, they would put it out there. But you still, I'm gonna be the first one to buy that book for you.
Okay. So what all three of these comments have in common is there's a kind of community circulation of text, of knowledge, of information, right? There's recommendations on podcasts. We're hearing from people we respect, right? People whose authority we trust to recommend text. We hear also from public talks or open sessions like this one where people talk about what they're reading. Sometimes there's that kind of close-in group of peers. So there's a little positive peer pressure. That's precisely how this story unfolded. Right? So in 1859, Martin Delaney publishes this story as a serial. It is a serialized publication that comes out weekly in the Afro-American magazine between 1859. It stops at 1861 because, of course, the Civil War is going on. Delaney begins to travel. He's a working abolitionist, so he's in Europe. He's all over the States. The war is happening, right? So there's an interruption in the novel. But you think about literate Black people and also literate white people, right? Reading this story of rebellion that comes out week after week. So this is your this is your, I'm not cool, what, Succession? Right? Like, this is your, the thing that you're watching every week, the thing you're tuning into. So we're talking about building a community of readers is what's happening in the 19th century. And what are these people reading? They're reading what we call speculative fiction. In the moment of active enslavement, right? Martin Delaney is telling a story of an alternate history of slavery. Even before slavery itself is history. So we're thinking about Afrofuture as this really brilliant and transgressive reimagining of the past and the future in the present. Martin Delaney is asking us to look at what if we have a story of a man named Henry Blake, who is actually the son of free West Indian planters, right? Who goes off to make his own adventure and is captured into slavery accidentally. And who lives and works in the South, meets a woman who is captured. And so in his pursuit of her, goes on to build this international rebellion. This is the story that he's communicating to other Black readers and even to white publishers, right? So we can think about Afrofuturism then, right, as a disposition to tell stories otherwise. A way to say that, okay, the receipts that we have in the past may look like this, but we do have that power of imagination to galvanize us toward another future. So next I want to talk about a similar text that works in much the same way. The other thing I'll say is also, I'm kind of speeding through for the interest of time, but another thing I'll say about this text is part 2 of this series, right? So people don't know what happens with him, like they don't know if he finds his girlfriend, his wife, war is going on, right? So he comes back and publishes the second part of the text. The final 6 chapters of this text are actually lost to history. So in the 1950s, African Americans get really interested in 19th century Black literature. And across the 20th century, Black writers are going to take up this story using historical events and kind of co-author a plausible or possible end to this novel. Then someone comes along and says, nope, this isn't actually good enough. So there's another revision of Blake or the Huts of America. So this one story tells us something about the collective power of Black storytelling. Okay, so the second novel I want to look at is another serialized text. Now, it's a little bit tricky because it's not technically in the 19th century, but it's in a thing historians like to call the long 19th century. So as Angela Tate reminded us, right, part of the story of the 19th century is also Reconstruction, right? What happens in the wake of Reconstruction, what happens after sort of the United States decides to make its contract with the South, right? Removing federal troops from that protection. A lot of people like to say that, Reconstruction failed. That's how I used to teach it. Right? But I've been learning recently to think about the ways that Reconstruction was it wasn't so much a failed project, right, as a project that was destroyed. So it didn't just kind of fail on its own, it didn't peter out, right? But the emergence of the Klan, the Knights of the White Camellia, state violence, state-sanctioned violence, extrajudicial violence, as my presenters have talked about, and also things like convict leasing, right, kept freed African Americans caught up in the material conditions of sort of exploited labor. So I'm talking about a text that is published in 1902, but takes place in the immediate aftermath of the end of Reconstruction. Right? It takes place in a period that historians call the Great Nadir. So we're talking about this period of real psychological anguish. A new century emerges, right? The 20th century turns, but Black people are still facing conditions of the 19th. A new century has emerged, and Black people are still facing lynching, right? Still subject to the same kinds of direct racism that shaped their movements in enslavement. So into this context, a woman named Pauline Hopkins writes another serialized novel called Of One Blood. In the interest of time, I'm going to be very brief about zipping through the plot. It's also pretty convoluted. It features a man named Ruel Briggs, who is this sort of he's attending medical school, right? This story is set in the 19th century, but post-emancipation. It's a kind of racial uplift novel. His love interest, Diane, is thought to be killed, but it's found out that she isn't killed, and she has been thrown into this limbo mental state. He tries to treat her with something called mesmerism, right? So this kind of hypnosis. And he goes on this international adventure. The protagonist, Ruel Briggs, goes on this international adventure to figure out a cure for Diane, his love, who is in this kind of mental limbo state. What I found fascinating about this novel is that Pauline Hopkins writes about this Black man, a biracial man, right, who nevertheless refuses, he decides not to pass as white after giving it an attempt, and finds himself in Ethiopia. Right? So he is in the sort of ancient kingdom of Meroe. He gets kidnapped and finds himself underground in a place called Tel Asser. I don't speak Arabic, but so I may be pronouncing the word incorrectly. But it has an analog today in modern day Iraq. So Pauline Hopkins is imagining Ruel Briggs going to this underground city in Ethiopia where he finds all kinds of sort of supernatural, almost like wizards, right? So he finds this crew of people who, since biblical days, have become technologically advanced. They are advanced in science and medicine, and he's essentially trying to take this cure back to the States to his wife, to cure her. It kind of ends like a Romeo and Juliet situation, like she gets poisoned, and Ruel and his companion, another man, they come back to the States. They try to revive Diane. Ultimately, they find out that all three of them are siblings. So this is why this ill-fated love never happened, and that's why it's all about one blood. So it's kind of scandalous, you know what I'm saying? Plot twist.
But I want to point out, right, that in this murmuring that you all are doing now, right, here's Pauline Hopkins. This is an image of her. In this murmuring that we're doing now, we can think about what it means for Black people in 1902 to be reading this story week after week. So I mean, they're really tuned in, right? There's a scandal going on, what is happening? Why are we in Ethiopia? Why are we underground, right? I want to argue here that she is a woman who is born in 1859. This is her, who grew up in Boston. In this text, she is pulling together a tragic narrative that nevertheless engages African American readers in a years-long practice of thinking beyond the here and now. So every week, folk are thinking about what African spirituality might look like. They're locating themselves in African spirituality and the supernatural. And the story itself has enough twists and turns to keep people coming back week after week. So there are some questions, again, that across these two texts, I think, stay with me, and I would love for us to talk more about them in our discussion. And that is, these are as follows, right? Thinking about what my colleagues have said about technologies and freedom, I wonder, what does it mean for these authors to be tracing an alternate history? What does it mean for these folks to be imagining histories otherwise? What are the stories that African American people are telling? And what are these alternate histories that help them imagine freedom? As they imagine freedom in the text, what does solidarity look like? What does it mean for African American readers in the United States to be wrapped up into this fantastical supernatural story that brings them into a secret hidden city in Ethiopia? Or what does it mean for African American readers to be reading this 19th century text where they're envisioning a rebellion that happens on the shores of the slave coast and also in Cuba? What are the pathways that these authors imagine for solidarity? Where is the Afrofuture? And what do we do, again, with a history that doesn't necessarily have proof? Right? Both of them imagine these mystical places or imagine alternate histories, and that's part of that aesthetic of Afrofuturism. What does it mean to imagine an alternate story? So I'm really interested in, if you think about how Juneteenth reemerges as a story that we were continuing to hold for ourselves, we're telling ourselves a story about Black protest, about community, right? How do we think freedom beyond the limits of sort of the proof that has happened in the past and use an alternate vision to imagine the future? Thank you. We have time for a few questions, and so if you have a question, I'm going to give you some time with some of my thoughts, but if you have a question, go ahead and get that ready, because as soon as I finish, I'll open it up to questions for the panel. And there were a couple of things that really stood out to me, one of which each of you in some way or the other called out the year 1859. And I'm just thinking, it reminded me of my history here, my fellow colleagues. John Brown's grade is 1859. And so I was really struck by this reverberation of that year. Madam Delaney is wild. Because can you imagine publishing in the same year that John Brown has his grade? John Brown goes to Frederick Douglass and is like, so, we're going to do this thing. And Frederick Douglass was like, respectfully, my black self cannot participate, but from what? Right? So that was really struck by that year, 1859. And then also, it made me Nicole, Dr. Ivy, is Delaney related to the Delaney sisters at all? Or Samuel Delaney?
So I know he's not related to
Okay.
Samuel Delaney, but I don't think he's related to the Delaney sisters either. I have to double check that, but I know he's not related to them.
I bring up Samuel Delaney if anyone is a speculative fiction or sci-fi head. Samuel Delaney is a Black science fiction writer who was one of the few Black science fiction writers, in addition to Octavia Butler, who win like Nebula Award. But the work is wild. It's like Sun Ra and Bootsy Collins on a page, if you can describe it. So I was really struck by that 1859 year and all of the reverberations of certain dates. And then I was really struck by Dan and Angela, both of you mentioning and talking about Juneteenth in a temporal sense, or in other words, time. Because of course what happens is that Black Texans who are enslaved don't find out that they are free until this incredible delay. And it makes me think about how time and frequency and syncopation and the fact that Afrofuturism isn't just about what it looks like, but also about time and music. But thinking about Juneteenth as both a here and a now and a past and a present, I was really struck by how you all were talking about when people found out and that they had to have their freedom delayed, but also that there's some historians doing work now on places in, I think it's Louisiana, Mississippi, where people were not told that emancipation had come, and literally were still enslaved well into the 20th century because they did not know, because people purposely kept the knowledge from them. And so again, to your point about like Juneteenth as a commemoration, but a commemoration of what? And then Dr. Ivy and all of us talking about the long 19th century. So there's a joke among 19th century historians, right? It's 100 years between 1800 and 1900, but so much changes. We go from fairly agrarian, all of this technology happens, and then so many of the choices of the 19th century reverberate into the 20th. So that's part of the reason we call it the long 19th century, because it doesn't just stop when 1900 hits. All of these reverberations keep happening, but also it's such a long century. Like if you look at 1600 to 1700, it sort of looks similar. But you look at 1800 to 1900 and you're really looking at a totally different landscape that is often would be totally futuristic and unrecognizable to someone born in 1800. So that's one of the reasons we call it the long 19th century. But I'm just really moved by some of the things that you all have said. The invocation of Sankofa. I'm going to be really upset if Watch Night becomes a federal holiday. And someone offers me brunch and it doesn't involve black-eyed peas, or somebody comes up with a fancy black-eyed pea meal, I'm going to be bitter. Also thinking about Yoruba cosmologies. So I'm sort of pausing to give people a chance if they want to ask a question. But I'm wondering for you, who is your 19th century futurist hero and why? That'll be my one question, and then I'm going to turn it to the audience.
Harriet Jacobs.
Yes, the loophole of retreat.
Yes.
Made me think about Henry Box Brown because, yeah, tell us about Harriet Jacobs though.
So when I read Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl as an undergrad, it literally changed my life. Not just thinking about the history of slavery, but also thinking about how brave it was for her to write about sexual abuse and sexual assault. And that also, she chose who was going to be the father of her children after her master attempted to assault her and impregnate her. And so, like I said, like Black women literally carrying the future in their bodies because of slavery being determined by the condition of the mother. And she said, my children are going to be born enslaved, but I'm going to choose who's going to be their father, and then I'm going to steal my own freedom until I can bring them to freedom.
And she lives within an attic for 7 years as she is escaping her enslavers. That's often thought of the loophole of retreat, which makes me think now much more of time and a different life.
I'm going to take a cliche answer for my favorite 19th century kind of Afrofuturist and say Frederick Douglass. There's good reason for this. I'm from Rochester, New York. I was born on South Avenue where his home was in Rochester, New York, just like 2 blocks from where his home would have been. And so, growing up in Rochester, New York, you hear a lot about Frederick Douglass. Frederick Douglass is very there. He lived there for over 25 years, created his newspaper there, the North Star. And so too, just to think about how, Frederick Douglass, utilized the Underground Railroad, and was truly a futurist. He lived in Rochester, New York because it was along the New York Central Railroad where he knew he could take trains to Canada in case he got into any trouble, which he did when, he was implicated in the John Brown raid, which John Brown wrote his provincial constitution at the home of Frederick Douglass for 3 weeks in Rochester, New York. And so, yes, he knew about the plot, right? And luckily he did go with it. So Frederick Douglass, the reason why he chose Rochester was because it was located along this railroad that went to Canada. He's somebody that really understands international lines. He's from a border state of Maryland. So he understands how to cross, north-south lines, American-Canadian lines. He goes across the pond, he travels the world. And so he understands the importance of being near borderlands and being near, locations where he can get out of Dodge in case trouble comes. And so a good fugitive knows, where to do their crimes, right? And they know how to get out, right? A good fugitive, right? You're a good fugitive, right? You know those things. And so I'll take the cliche, I guess, because I'm from Rochester.
And Rochester is a big center in the 19th century of spiritualism, which part of a lot of abolitionists were very much into spiritualism, which is that idea of the afterlife and sort of the speculative in the afterlife. And so there's something in which Frederick was like, I support you in your choices, people. And sometimes would go once or twice, but was like, no, thank you.
Right, and I guess it is a space of just futurism in terms of spirituality. You got the Mormons that start in Western New York. You get the Shakers. You get all of these kind of religious revitalization, movements that are happening there. I always say, Western New York, in Western New York near Buffalo in Canada, it was like California free love before California. And so it was the Western fringes of society. And so they were trying out all these new things. The Mormons keep moving south. They started in Western New York, but they keep moving, west until they get out to Salt Lake City where there's no more further west you can go. So they're trying to stay on the fringes because of their ideals of marriage and things of that nature. And so it's a real liberal space, and it's a real kind of futurist space where people are starting to kind of rethink things. You think of the women's suffrage movement, the abolitionist movement, the temperance movement, all getting started in that area. So.
Dr. Ivy.
Gosh, this is a tough question. I don't have a single person. I feel like I'm gonna try not to ramble. I think probably the most heroic people are people who we can't know from history. I have a friend who says, the smartest person alive is probably somebody's grandma who figured out something really like, I think, because of the nature of the archives, I feel like my 19th century hero is probably somebody, who I imagine has done amazing things. You look at the stories, right? Like you talked about Henry Box Brown, think about William and Ellen Crafts, like this fair-skinned couple who pretended to be a master and a slave, right? Or an enslaved person. Ellen Craft being a light-skinned Black woman who wraps herself up, bandages her arms so she can't sign any document, and pretends to be her husband's owner, like pretends to be a white man traveling with her manservant. That is so brilliant, right? This idea of playing with racial hierarchies and putting on this kind of theater and knowing that people are gonna see what they imagine, So
of course, I'm a respectable white man traveling with my manservant. Of course, I don't need to sign anything because my hand is bad. Like that kind of foresight, I think is really admirable. I also think, of course, Harriet Tubman, good grief. You know what I mean? Like, good grief. The knowledge required, the more you learn about Harriet Tubman, the more you have to respect Harriet Tubman. You know what I'm saying? Like, the story of just, returning, gathering up family members, gathering up community members, but also, leaving her husband. You know what I'm saying? Like, her husband cheated on her. And she married a young, I was 30 years younger than she was. You know what I'm saying? So thinking about Harriet Tubman as a hot girl today, it's really exciting. That's kind of ridiculous, but her husband, think about how heartbreaking that is, right? To go back to free your husband and he's married somebody else. And you were like, for real? I walked back from
risking capture and
death. Right. To come back for you and you're not someone else. You're not angry anyway. So to me, that's also profoundly heroic. And then to think about how she used her knowledge of coastal geography to be a spy, right, during the Civil War. So she didn't just sort of leave, she didn't escape and do all these heroic things, right, and kind of stay where she was. But in the middle of the Civil War, she boards a ship and is able to call out to enslaved people along the coast of the Cumberland River. So she's organizing people using sound. The more you learn about Harriet Tubman, right, the more you like Harriet Tubman. The idea of when she's in upstate New York, she founds a home for elderly colored, right? So for like a senior living space. For older Black people to rest. We're talking now about the politics of rest, right? People talk about, I love the nap ministry, right? This idea that rest is important. This is Harriet Tubman in the 19th century. One of the acts that she takes after a lifetime of heroism is to create a place for Black people to rest. And the last thing I'll say about Harriet Tubman is, if you've seen her shawl at Angela's Museum, it's one of my favorite objects. Because you look at it and you think Harriet Tubman is this tall, kind of, brolic, you think that she, then you look at the shawl and she's such a teeny tiny little person.
Short people.
Right, and as a short people, I am so heartened by how tiny she was. The shawl is so tiny and it's really magical. You gotta love Harriet. The last thing I'll say, another person I really enjoy is Anna Julia Cooper, who is born in the 19th century, actually dies in the 1960s. But she publishes this book called A Voice from the South. Okay, how many people know who Booker T. Washington is? You know who Booker T. Okay, right, we all know.
Be like a 5 finger.
Wait, no, I'm not trying to trash Booker T. Washington today. But the point is, but one of the things that Anna Julia Cooper does is in this moment where you've got these great, these sort of celebrated Black male dignitaries writing about, here's what Black people should be. The Black man should be this. This is what we need to do as a race of men. She writes a book that is kind of similar to Up From Slavery. It's her own kind of manifesto, and she calls it A Voice from the South. So, whereas Booker T. Washington has kind of cornered this market on I am the voice from the South, she's saying, here's a voice, right? And it's my voice. And one of the things that she says in that book, she directly addresses the suffrage question. Because at this moment, the book comes out in 1892. At this moment, the prominent Black male intelligentsia of the time are actively advocating for the vote. And she writes that, Black women are really important to the franchise and to the future of sort of Black safety in America. She writes very explicitly about how Black women have been left out of the kind of major social movements around Black liberation, post-Reconstruction,
And she has this thing that I remember, and my memory is terrible. She has this thing that I still remember. She writes in 1892, "How shall I so stunt and stultify myself so as to," she said, basically the question is not, how shall I so stunt and stultify myself so as to be swallowed up by some little man. Right? And so she then says what the question is, which is the question of Black women's civic participation. And I just love that. I feel like that is pretty badass. You know what I'm saying? To be writing in 1892, you know, in this backdrop of, you know, a real vocal, I mean, this is, you know, post PBS pitchback. Like, this is post these Black male leaders who get elected to office during Reconstruction. And she's saying, you know, I'm not going to stunt and stultify myself so as to be swallowed up by some little man. Right? And it led a very good friend of mine to look at me and say, am I the little man? Anyway, those are.
Right, and getting back to the long 19th century, right, both Anna Julia Cooper and Harriet Tubman passes in 1913, Anna Julia Cooper in the 60s, her home is still standing in Washington, D.C. She made a point to say, whenever I enter, my whole race enters with me. So thinking too about like sort of Black woman as that embodiment of Afrofuturism. I'm just also really struck by this conversation of people. So Frederick Douglass is often cited as the most photographed person American in the 19th century. He did that very strategically to take up photography as a way to show Black people. So there are all of these photographs of him and thinking about that, but also that this assumption that that futurism will always rely on hyper-technology, hyper-robotics. And there's a way that Harriet Tubman's particular knowledge of the coast, right, her knowledge of people, her use of sound, like it's not anti-technology, it's certainly technology, but it's not necessarily a technology that we might think of that's advancing white supremacy or invested in white supremacy. Right? It's not the same kind of algorithm. It's a fugitive algorithm that takes up nature and sort of reminds me of sort of like orcas are organizing right now. If I see the orcas and the seals come together, I'll know that we're really about to pop. Everything's about to pop off. They're unionized. But I say that to say if you're not following the news, sort of the orcas have started to attack boats. But they're teaching each other how to do it across both the Pacific and Atlantic Ocean, right? And so that's not a technology that we would think of as like it's an algorithm that they plugged in and it got plugged into their brain. They're teaching each other. So even advancing this idea that community can be radical and futuristic, and that it may not be hyper-tech, but it could be also knowing the land. Right, and in a white supremacist system that focuses on capitalism and the destruction of the land, that Afrofuturism might offer something very different and a hybrid of that, which could be really interesting to think about. So I'm going to pause there because I could talk to the three of you all day. In fact, I might bother you later. But I wanted to offer the audience a time to ask any questions that you all might have. Yes? Right ahead. And the mic is coming for you there.
First of all, thank you all for your presentation. It's really great. I've enjoyed it so far. I guess my question is, I'm trying to figure out how to formulate this. I think there's an overlap between these two concepts, and I'm wondering what style you guys find yourselves in any way in studying Afrofuturism, also studying critical race theory, and also, if so, like, what does that look like, and where does that take you in your studies, and your work, and your scholarship, et cetera?
I'll go. So I didn't start studying critical, quickly, I'm trying to give myself a minute. I didn't start studying critical race theory until I was in graduate school at Yale University. So I learned critical race theory as a way to understand that the law that
that I run afoul of, know that the law itself, right, is based on a racist history. So I think actually one of the earliest examples of like the intersection between critical race theory and Afrofuturism that I can think of is the work of Patricia Williams, who's a lawyer, and she has this book called The Alchemy of Race and Rights. So she talks about how the law creates a human citizen or subject, right, the subject of the law, and that is also a legal fiction. And then in that text, she writes about this imagining a panda bear. And so it's like, wait, what? But she uses that technique to say, like, I feel like I'm crazy, right? As a Black woman in America who is both subject to the law, but is not necessarily the person who's named as having legal rights in the law, I feel extremely schizophrenic. And so the person I can think of is Patricia Williams, and I refer you to her text, The Alchemy of Race and Rights.
I would say I also was introduced to it in grad school, but through Kimberly Crenshaw's article about intersectionality. That word is tossed around in a cavalier way, in my opinion, because it has gone beyond what she was actually writing about, and that legally Black women did not exist because the category of race did not include gender, and the category of gender did not include race. And so Black women stand at this intersection of race and gender, and because the legal protections did not recognize how they intersect, Black women had no protection, they had no legal rights. And so when I think about Afrofuturism, that's why I say, like, thinking about how Black women, the history of slavery was the history of extracting labor, and first it was extracting men, and then they realized, particularly in the United States, once the internal slave trade emerged after the abolition of the slave trade in the early 1800s, Black women became important, but yet they were also continuously ungendered. That's why I say Harriet Jacobs writing about her experience was great, because it meant that she was saying she was a woman, but yet women were not supposed to talk about these things. Ladies weren't supposed to talk about these things. Or you can think about Ida B. Wells. Her first lawsuit was because she was ejected from a railroad car because she sat in a lady's car, and they said, you are not a lady because you were Black. And so when you're thinking about, like, gender and Afrofuturism, which is some of the work that I do, I think about how these categories cannot fully capture Black women's experiences, and that Black women's work is attempts to say, you're forgetting about us, and if you are going to forget about us, we're going to be over here doing our own thing, and we'll wait for you to catch up.
I think, so my mom's partner read this book, They Came Before Columbus, with me when I was in the 4th grade. And it led to very difficult situations for every elementary school teacher I ever had. And basically what this book says is that, like, Columbus didn't discover America, so you can imagine, like, a 9 or 10-year-old me being like, guess what? So I actually feel like I practically learned about critical race theory as a 9 and 10-year-old. Particularly integrating schools where I was the only one, and where I often actually had to invoke various parts of the law as a reminder to my teachers to teach and treat me appropriately. So I practically learned about critical race theory as a child, and then read critical race theory as an undergrad. But I'm thinking as we celebrate Juneteenth, as I went to these schools where I was integrating, I actually dressed up for Halloween as Juneteenth. And I was like really a problem for people. Literally integrated the school and showed up in middle school dressed as Juneteenth to educate my teachers and peers who seemed to need that. And my costume was like all Black, and then like every Black liberation button and slogan that I could find. Then they tried to institute a dress code. And that did not work very well for me either. So that's how I practically learned about critical race theory, I think, and the intersection with futurism, because again, it was about gender. They instituted this dress code and it impacted, in particular, girls more. So I broke the dress code and then taped a ruler to my knee. Because what they said was, if you break the dress code, we have a right to take you into a room and measure your clothes. And I was like, you're gonna do what with me? Who's 12 or 13? And who's gonna do this? And is this appropriate? So I was like, I'm gonna break the dress code, and I wore a ruler on my leg so that I could show them that I had broke the dress code. And then, so yeah, I choose intellectual violence as well. Yeah. Any other questions, comments? I see. Oh. You can do it.
Thank you. This is amazing. As the mother of a child who is taught European history to death, and I told her school, you have to do better, you need a class with these 4 people, and they're like, yeah, we're trying. What recommendations does the panel have for parents who want our children to really know our history deeper, beyond PBS? Well, what, so specific? Books, podcasts, classes?
If you're in the DC area, there's the Zen Education Project. There's also a group called Teaching for Change, which tries to address the fact that there's a missing group of books featuring children of color, and particularly Black children. So they actually have reading lists, and then they actually have resources for parents so that you can do continuing ed as a way to provide something additional. And then they also, I think, do like a summer reading program. And it's not all like books, because reading can be done in multiple ways. So sometimes it's audiobooks, sometimes it's comics, sometimes it's graphic novels. So that would be some of the way to do the parallel education. I know certainly that my mom had to do parallel education because everything was about European history and the erasure of Black people. And so coming to museums like this, coming to different kinds of museums may also be a way to constantly create a counter narrative. My mom also did really obnoxious things like if there was a Barbie commercial, we had to like talk about it. We did it in 7. You know, she'd be like, what doesn't look right? We're other people, like just simple questions that was constantly making me think, and that I think looking back were sort of low effort, low impact for her as a parent, because she was asking me a question and then just listening to me. So there's some of those strategies that she used.
And I think, one important thing that you're doing is just, simply asking the question and questioning the teacher. I think it all begins there. Because, some parents don't even do that, because they're just like, go to school, learn what they're teaching you, and, prepare for the state, test, right? And so I think it's just brilliant, the fact that you brought this up and that you understand that this is a problem and that you're gonna, try to pressure the school to do more, but also understanding that you have to kind of fill in those gaps, right, for the Black history. And so, then just one other reference I was going to give you was just like in class with Greg Carr from Howard University. Great, every Saturday, I think at 12, he's doing these classes, and they're amazing. I mean, you can go back and look at the catalog or in class with Carr, just to kind of get it started.
I'm going to plug the Searchable Museum, which is the National Museum of African American History and Culture's gradual turning our physical exhibitions into digital exhibitions. And there are lesson plans, there are videos, there are extra stories from objects that are in our collection that are not on display as well, to lend a deeper understanding of a variety of topics. And so I think, as of now, I think all of the history galleries have been turned into digital exhibitions.
Thank you very much. Very good presentation. I'm from the Baltimore Jewish community. So my question is, the Jewish nation has been enslaved in Egypt for 400 years, and we have suffered from persecution and the like. So my question is, in your education venture, I don't know whether it's at the museum in Washington or at other places, do you make mention of the fact, because we have a common history, because of slavery and how people are determined to be freed in community. Do you all make an emphasis about what my people went through the experience comparison and all that, and some of the ways where we have worked together, the founding of the NRA, CP in 1904 in Niagara Falls, New York? Do you do anything like that, where we have worked together, coming from a common background, and how we work together against these social ills, if you will, even to today? That's my question.
Sure, the Jewish Museum of Maryland, which is actually not far, it's walking distance from here, does this incredible job of making this overlap, particularly in cities like Baltimore, where you have Jewish communities and Black communities in deeply close proximity. I'm talking about options and availability of very particular 20th century coalition building.
And the Holocaust Museum in DC and the Smithsonian have collaborated several times on these kind of topics.
So you're going to be our, oh, did you want to go ahead?
Just two more things. To the question about resources for parents, I wonder if there are folks in this room who can identify local resources. I'm new to Baltimore. I've only lived here for about 2 years, and I know, I know the Lewis Museum does amazing things. I know the BMA, the Baltimore Museum of Art, had a project with a tall painter at Los Angeles. I can't remember his name. 4 foot biennale, very tall.
Not Marcus Bradford.
Thank you, Mark Bradford. They had a program with Mark Bradford and a local youth group. So I want to open that. I want to hold space, make space, get out the way for folks here in Baltimore who are doing really amazing things, who might want to connect with you, because I know that there's stuff that's happening in youth work, and I will always give a plug to BYP 100, Black Youth Project 100. It's online and it's youth driven, so that's one way to put parents in conversation with how young people are making change in their world. But that is very, very largely based in Chicago. So I wonder what, if folks in this room know what kinds of resources are there in Baltimore specifically. I didn't mean to hijack you.
No, not at all. You're going to be our last question. And then if you have resources, what I'd love to ask is if you can actually meet over at the table at the entrance to do sort of a quick resource compare share with each other. I think that would be wonderful. And I'm just trying to be respectful of the time, because this was supposed to be 3 to 4. We're doing some time travel together. So I don't want to cut anybody off, but I want to be respectful of time. So go right ahead.
I have a question, one for Dan. Do you think technology is more of a force for good and change and empowerment and liberation, or is it more used to divide and oppress people? For instance, social media, when it first came out, there's a lot of optimism surrounding it. It would connect people, it would make it easier to organize protests. But now it seems like social media is more of a force to divide and to spread misinformation and propaganda and to control people. So what do you think about that?
Yeah, I would speak like a philosopher. I think that technology in and of itself can be neutral, and it just depends on how people use it, right? And so, I'm just thinking about the technologies in the 19th century, whether it's the telegraph, or it's the railroad, or steam power and stuff like that. Of course, these apparatuses by the power holders were being used to oppress Black people and to not let them be mobile and use these apparatuses. But obviously they were able to, work around these apparatuses, and sometimes working without them. You talk about Harriet Tubman. And to me, like even, like a Harriet Tubman individual, these people really have these kind of modern sensibilities that we have. If you think about it, Harriet Tubman was global. She moved to Canada for like 7 years, right? She lived in St. Catharines. She's green, she can use the stars. And she's gender aware. She leaves the United States and she says, I'm leaving Uncle Sam's land, I'm going to the Queen soil. So she understands that Canada is controlled by a queen. And she's saying, as a Black woman, what can a queen do for me? We know what Uncle Sam did, right? And so, I mean, she's global, green, and gender aware. Like, if you're not global, green, and gender aware today, like, who are you? What are you thinking? Global, green, and gender. We have to be those things, right? You know, what are we doing? We're not doing, we're behind. And so, to me, you know, technology, to me, it can be a neutral. But many times, the power holders that are creating it, they have these intentions for it. And these intentions are not good intentions for, you know, Black and brown people and also people that can't access the technology, right? But once we get a hold of it and what we do with it, I mean, I think is very, you know, speaks to our kind of human spirit and what we want to do with it and how we want to kind of open it up and liberate it and allow other people to have access to it as well. And so I don't look at it as either or kind of a good or evil thing. In and of itself, as a philosopher, I would say I think it would be neutral, but we know sometimes the creators of it, what they want to do, what they're trying to harness it for, and it's for it. But you know, the question becomes is like, how do we, you know, regain that control, and how do we redirect that control to make it a liberating force, which Black people do in the 19th century.
Thank you, Nicole, Angela, Dan. Thank you so much. Thank you to the audience. Thank you to the audience. Again, those of you who have resources that you think you'd like to share, please share them at the Black table there. You can take a sheet of paper and folks can just write down those resources. I can see if we can put them up on our website. So thank you so much, everyone, and happy Juneteenth.